Okay, so hello. Today on Chuku's chat, we are speaking to Ike Anya. I'm really excited with this one. So Ike Anya is a Nigerian public health doctor and writer with many years of clinical and public health experience, both in the UK and Nigeria. Previously Director of Public Health for Kensington and Chelsea. His focus in recent years has been his two health organisations that he's co-founded. So the first is called Nigeria Health Watch. It's an award-winning advocacy. It promotes and facilitates system improvement and accountability in health. Then the second, not one is not enough.
I'm Nigerian, what do you think?
Ep3, which provides expert advice, training, research and consultancy across the African continent. It marries up technical expertise with a thorough grasp of local issues and context. And as if that wasn't enough, because why have two organizations when you could do some more? He was also the co-founder of TedxEuston, held in London from 2009 to 2019. It became one of Europe's most important African-led forums and the biggest TEDx in the world, focused exclusively on Africa. Thank you for joining us today.
Nice.
Thank you, Fee. Thank you, Emeka. It's great to be
welcome.
here, and thank you for what you're doing in promoting Nigerian food and culture globally.
You're most welcome. Just looking forward to getting this conversation today.
Yes.
So we're going to be chop, chat, chilling. So we're going to talk about some things that nourish you, things that feed your soul, and then we're going to chat. We know you've got a special topic. I'm particularly excited to delve into some of this. I think it's really important for Ife and I, and actually what we do here at Chuku. And then we're going to chill. We're going to just kick back, talk about some things like culture, some music, maybe bust a few little jokes. You see? So yeah, get into it.
Okay, so let's chop. If you were cooking for one of your heroes, who would you cook for?
Wait.
You can see that I saw the thinking already. Like, Something tells me we're not going to get just one answer. But let's see. If you were cooking for one of your heroes, who would you cook for? What would you cook for them, and why?
Right. I've been thinking about this a lot. Actually, I think that's the bit of the whole thing I would thought most about. And I think that's partly because I've always found the concept of heroes a shaky one, in the sense that, we are all human, and all the people, there are people I admire for certain things, but I also know, as we all are, there are also flaws in them. So, I don't have that kind of hero worship thing. But so I was actually going to say probably it would be my parents, because I think, they are the nearest things to heroes, because I don't want to see their flaws, if you like. But it just actually struck me that probably it would be Michelle Obama. Yeah. And why Michelle Obama? I just think she's a phenomenal person. The grace and strength that she's displayed, I've always been a big fan. In fact, interestingly, when her husband first declared for president, I was a Hillary Clinton supporter at that point. And it was more almost sort of thinking, well, if Michelle picked him, there must be something about him. Because she just embodies that whole, the sort of realness of Black women and African women, and, the strength and the grace and the glamour and the way that, they just pick up everything that's thrown at them and just keep going and not make a fuss about it. Yes, Nigerian men probably do a lot, but they'll tell you about it 5 times. And it's the women, who are the silent, and I mean, just look at what's happening with the demonstrations, the youth demonstrations against SARS, the end SARS protest. It's a lot of it's the backbone has been the women. And so, yeah, so the Michelle Obama it would be, and what would I cook for her? I would, I mean, I'd probably cook, I like rice. And in fact, for a long time, probably until I went to boarding school, I didn't like to eat swallow, pounded yam or gari or any of that. I now love all of that, all the different soups. But I think I would probably go for a rice dish because that's what, that's my comfort thing. And it would probably be a coconut rice, which I learned to cook from my cousin when I was living on my own, my first job. And it's quite simple, just some tins of coconut milk, some corned beef, onions and other condiments, and you cook it richly. And I would probably serve her as a appetizer, starter, whatever you want to call it, some granuts from Nsukka, which is where I grew up, where I spent my childhood. And the granuts there, I have not seen granuts like them, all my life. They're the small, not the chunky bits, and they are sweet and really nutty. So I would serve her that, maybe with Nsukka bananas as well, which are quite delicious. I've not really been able to eat bananas since I moved to the UK because, it's like, where's the taste? What's this? Compared to the Nsukka bananas I grew up with, which had, rich taste. So I'd probably do that. I'd probably have some palm wine from Abeba, my ancestral hometown, on tap. And I'd probably be playing her either some Highlife music or some Onyeko Onwenu music. And I think that would be quite an evening, afternoon, whatever it is.
I want to come. I was listening. I was like, as he painted the scene, I was like, I want to try these bananas. I want the groundnut. I'm here for it all. Sounds great.
I think that's really interesting because, I think you're the only person that we've spoken to who's touched on the music that you would have to set the scene, which is I think that's actually really important actually, and we have to add that in
what song you playing in the background?
I mean, what's the vibe
I mean, I think that's important to me. It's interesting, sort of growing up. I mean, my parents were big entertainers, my father particularly. He loved to have parties. He loved to have he was he taught at the university in Nsukka, and, he would throw open the doors to all the young students, his postgraduate students, and, and I just love that vibe of talking and music playing and, ideas flowing and delicious drink and delicious food. So I think, music is very important. And I remember sort of having this vision as well when I was a teenager of, when I'd listened to Sade's Adu's music. I don't know if you know, well, you probably will. Hope. She had some really bluesy songs that, I would just imagine myself growing up sitting in some dimly lit nightclub, chatting with some people and talking great things. And I've actually sort of have had some evenings and nights like that in real life that's made me sort of pinch myself and think it's happening.
That's super nice. It just made me think, obviously you saw us how vehemently we were nodding when you talked about Sade, and because if and I had these sorts of ideas, okay, cool. In the restaurant usually it's like Afro beats that gets played, but it'd be really nice to have, as you say, a kind of a bluesy sort of chill out night or day, depending on when it makes sense, and you're playing that sort of vibe.
And I love live music as well. In fact, when I was a newly qualified doctor working in Abuja, a friend of mine we became friends because I always used to go to her singing sessions. An amazingly talented woman called Yinka Davies used to sing live at the Hilton Hotel in Abuja. And, I spent many nights there. And at some point she would sometimes drag me in when she was going on a break and make me sing and fill in for her. I only had 2 songs in my repertoire, which were both Onyeka. But yeah. But somewhere there's a photograph of me actually singing in a nightclub, which I think scandalized some of my colleagues and some of my father's friends as well.
I just wanted to just understand a bit more about with the peanuts and the banana,
Yes.
how they're actually cooked. Like, what is the process?
Well, they're not really
I was
cooked.
like, can I recreate it?
It's street food. So, in Nsukka, when I was growing up, and, in many parts of Nigeria, depending on the season, in the dry season, you'd have mostly young women, sometimes young, boys and girls, going around with trays, and they'd have some bunches of bananas and like a polythene bag full of roasted peanuts or groundnuts, and and people would either buy 1 banana and maybe a small cup of groundnuts, or a whole bunch of bananas and several cups of groundnuts. And it'd be something you just ate. We as school children would eat it during break time. Workers in the office might have it as a sort of snack lunch. And often as well, it's interesting in offices, you might have them, you might have these hawkers hovering around. And I remember when I went to get my first, when I attempted to get my first Nigerian passport, when I was hoping to come on an elective to the UK as a medical student. And the immigration officer, who were, not being very helpful because I wasn't a wealthy person who might tip them for the passport, said, well, at least medical student, you can buy us groundnuts. So I remember, I bought them some groundnuts from a young woman. And then I think in the rainy season, which is when I think the groundnuts are harvested, they are boiled and salted in their shells. And so instead of being, they would be sold in their shells, and then you would find husks of groundnuts everywhere at that time of year. But, it's actually also that interesting cycle of, it's time for boiled groundnuts and then it's time for roasted groundnuts. But I'm a big fan of roasted groundnuts, whatever the season. I think the closest thing to those Nsukka groundnuts I've come across, it's either Lidl or Aldi, who do, just plain small, not chunky peanuts, not salted too much, just roasted lightly.
Yeah. They are a wonderful thing. Like, we talk about it at home sometimes. It's like,
and biscuits and groundnuts. I don't know why that's not a national, dish. Like biscuits and roasted peanuts, like very cheap, and it can make, any day. There was the Igbo conference at SUAS, I think 2 years ago, and they had that during the break, and it was like, it took me right back, because that was the most basic birthday party, the poorest family, more or less. You could buy 3 or 4 packets of biscuits and, a heap of roasted groundnuts, and tasted wonderful. Yeah.
So let's get into this chat.
I'm excited. Sorry, I'm so excited.
So you wanted to speak about talking to our elders, why their stories of our histories matter to our future. So, like, why was this like an important topic for you to share today?
I think why it's probably, I'm probably being very self-indulgent, because at an age where I'm beginning to think about a lot of, the history and what happened before. And I've just finished the draft of my first book, which I've been working on forever. Not consistently working on it, but trying to fit it in with everything else I've been doing over the last 8 years has been quite a challenge. But I finally got a draft manuscript that my agent was happy to start sending out to publishers in September. And funnily enough, I've always seen myself, when I was young, I probably thought I liked reading a lot, and I thought I would probably write as well, because I used to try my hand at writing in primary school. But by the time I got to medical school and started working as a doctor, and life was so hectic, I just thought that dream's gone, it will never happen. But, through a combination of exceptionally serendipitous things that happened, I found myself with an opportunity to be published in a very prestigious literary journal called Granta. And that was in 2012. And that just opened up a whole, I had agents and publishers approaching me saying, we loved your piece in Granta, and if you have a whole, if you're working on a book, we'll be interested in it. And I remember thinking, and I remember before the Granta piece came out, a friend of mine who was a writer had said to me, when that piece comes out, agents and publishers and people will approach you. And if they ask you if you're working on a book, say yes. And I said, but I'm not working on a book. And she said, just shut up, just say yes. Even if it's in your head, just say yes. And she was, absolutely right. That's what happened. And so that's actually how I then forced myself to take some time out to start the skeleton of the book, because I thought to myself, people have completed 2, 3, 4 manuscripts and not been able to get an agent or a publisher interested. And here I am with just 3,000 words in a literary journal, and people want to talk to me, and it would be criminal, I thought, not to make the best of that opportunity. So I started doing that. And I thought that once I did it, that would be my only foray into writing and all that. But then when I moved to the UK in 2001, I had an uncle who had lived here since the 50s. So he more or less became my Uncle Lawrence Chinegundo. He was my mother's first cousin. And he and his family more or less became my UK family. And the first few weeks I was here, he invited me, for the family to welcome me, all his kids and the grandchildren. And so his father and my maternal grandmother were siblings, and they come from Ebe in Enugu State, which is about 3 hours drive from Abeba, my ancestral hometown. And I'd often as a child wondered how my grandparents met, given the distance and the fact that Abeba people tended to marry locally. And on that afternoon, I asked my uncle, I said, by the way, how did my grandfather come to marry your aunt? And secondly, why was your father and my grandfather, why were they so close? Because I remember as a child, the closeness they had wasn't just the closeness of brothers-in-law, they were friends. And I remember seeing the 2 old men sitting on the veranda. He would travel and come and visit my grandfather. And he said, oh, that's because they knew each other as little boys. I said, but how could that have been? And basically, to cut a long story short, my grandmother's brother had been kidnapped from Ebe and sold into slavery in Abeba as a little boy. And my grandfather, lived nearby as a little boy, Abeba boy, and they became friends. And, I won't basically, that's what I then, I was fascinated by the story, and I started thinking I want to write about this.
Mm.
This was while I was still in the middle of writing the memoir about becoming a doctor in Nigeria. And I was thinking, hang on. So I was saying my second book, and people were saying, hang on, you haven't written the first one. But to cut a long story short, my grandparents all had really fascinating stories, really fascinating histories, that I've always been interested in history. And so as a little boy, I would always ask questions. Mama, how did you do this? How did you do that? And on my father's side, my grandmother was formidable as well because she lost her husband very early. She had, lots of children, under 10 to look after, and her husband's relatives took every single thing they owned. And so they went from being quite comfortable to penury. She was working on a construction site, the only woman carrying rocks and, all of that. But she was such a dogged woman that, she ended up bringing up my father, who did a PhD at Cambridge, that widow's son. And so I think, so I've long been fascinated by those two stories of my grandmothers. But then, so I've been working since lockdown, thanks to Zoom. I've been talking to my father, my mother, their siblings, just trying to piece together pictures and stories about them. I think the other thing that really drove my sense of history and interest in the past was my parents living through the Biafran War. Mm. So they had been students in the UK. My father finished his PhD in '65. They got married. My mother was in her final year at Royal Holloway in London, Surrey. And they moved back in '66 to Nsukka to the university there. And by '67, the Biafran War had broken out. And by '68, there were refugees sleeping on bare earth and not sure where the next meal would come from. And even as a little boy, I always used to think, how do you cope with that? How do you go from, we're sitting here chatting, and then tomorrow in 6 months' time, we don't know where the next meal is coming from. We're, sleeping in the bush, no roof over our heads. How does the human spirit deal with that? And what that has always created in me is a sense of, I've never felt the comfort of people thinking, oh, everything's fine, and it will continue to be fine. I always think everything is fragile and and so I believe in seizing the day and the moment, because I know that my parents didn't know, if you had told them in August '65 when they're getting married that in 3 years' time they'd be sleeping in the bush with their little son, they would have laughed. Mm. And I think, with lockdown and this 2020 and all it's thrown, I think in some ways that mindset has helped me. And that's where I think knowing about your past can help infuse, how you deal with your present and your future. And I remember when the early days of lockdown, talking to my father, and I said to him, one of the things that I am struggling with, I was pretty, I was lucky to be one of those who didn't feel too, it didn't throw me in the way that it threw a lot of people. And I know, different people reacted in different ways and are still reacting in different ways. But what I found difficult at that beginning was the uncertainty. And I said to my father, if you said to me, we're going to have to be indoors for 4 months, I could mark the days off my calendar. Mm. And no, but it's this not knowing, is it 4 months, is it 8 months, is it 2 years? And I said, how did you guys deal with that during the Biafran War? Because surely you had no idea the war was going to last 6 months, a year, 2. And he said, you just had to take every day as it came, knowing that the next day things might get better or worse. And so that's also what I've been trying to do through this year. and trying to, you know, and he said you have to use each day for whatever you can in it. And, you know, so I think there's that. But I think the other aspect of why I think listening to the stories of our fathers and mothers and grandfathers and grandmothers is important is one of the things that made me decide, actually, I will write this book about my grandmothers was when I was doing driving lessons, my instructor, you know, he was a West London, you know, sort of second, third generation Irish geezer, if you like, you know, Ollie. And so while we would be driving, I would be telling him these stories about my grandparents. And he would say, man, that's so fascinating. You know, I'd buy the book, I'd watch the film, because we know so much. He says, you know, we know so much about 19th century Britain and Europe, but we don't really get much about what lives in 19th century Africa, you know, was like and what was happening. And so he said, and I remember thinking to myself, if this guy who hardly shows an interest in books says he'll buy this book, and you know, and the stories gripped him, then you know, it probably will grip a few other people. But I think, you know, knowing who you are grounds you and helps you make sense of yourself. I think especially as Black people, as Africans, in a world that will often say to you, you are nothing, you do not exist. You know, you go into museums, you don't see anyone that looks like yourself, except maybe perhaps holding up cups or, you know, for the king, behind the king and the courtiers. And I think, you know, that was one of the things I was very fortunate in that my parents made sure we grew up very, although, you know, they were academics and we grew up in a very cosmopolitan town in Nsukka, but they made sure we knew all our Aruba history and we performed all the rites of passage. And I think it was when I came to the UK that I began to appreciate what that meant, and hearing those stories and knowing those stories meant, because it meant that I had a sense of myself in a way that I think some people didn't. And I remember sort of, I was a second or third year registrar, and I was very lucky to have been selected to attend a reception at Buckingham Palace for young scientists and researchers. And, you know, I remember one of my colleagues, you know, white English colleagues saying to me, you know, are you nervous? Are you nervous about going to the palace? And I said, nervous, why would I be? I said, well, you know, like, the etiquette and the rituals and, you know, not knowing how to behave. And I said, well, you know, if Queen Elizabeth came to Abuja, she wouldn't know how to break the kola nut, she wouldn't know in what order the palm wine should be poured. Yeah, so it's the same. If I use the wrong cutlery, tough. You know, I know stuff she doesn't know, she knows stuff I don't know. It's, you know, I think it was that sense of, you know, that put it in place. So I wasn't ever, you know, I never felt if people said, oh, you can't, I didn't have a sense of, and I think also growing up in Nigeria helped, especially when I talked to my cousins who grew up here about the same age. And so for instance, my cousins would tell me how when they were growing up, if there was a Black person on telly, whoever was sitting in front of the telly would go, John, Frank, Vincent, come, there's a Black person on telly. And they would all rush down. And he said often before they got to the telly, the person had disappeared. You know, and I grew up in a place where everyone on telly was Black. It was the white people that were the aberration. You know, all the judges, the doctors, everyone was Black. And, you know, I think that also is important to know those things. And, you know, even more, you know, broader stories. So there's been a lot of talk about decolonizing curriculum, and a lot of well-meaning people say, well, you know, this is just Marxist or leftist or, you know, woke people trying to change things. But there's a very important thing, there's a reason why it's important that's only come to my appreciation in perhaps the last 2 or 3 years, which is that, I told you I grew up in a university town and all that. But in primary school, we learned things like Mungo Park, a Scottish explorer, discovered the River Niger. Now, this is the River Niger that, people had been bathing and sailing and trading on for centuries before Mungo Park ever set foot on it. And yet Nigerians, 10, 12 years, 16, 20 years after independence, were still teaching their children that Mungo Park discovered the River Niger. And at the same time, no one told me until perhaps in the last 10 years about the Oba of Benin, who spoke Portuguese in the 16th century, having spent time at the court of the king in Portugal with the ambassador his father had sent there, or about the Ugandan ethnic group. And that's the one that really shocked me, actually, because, I'm a doctor, I'm interested in history, and so I thought I knew everything about history of medicine, but it was only in the last 10 years I discovered that there was a Ugandan tribe, ethnic group that was, I don't like to use tribe, sorry, that were doing cesarean sections in the 19th century, documented by a Scottish missionary, and, successfully with mother and baby surviving. And it's, in an early edition of the BMJ, it's recorded, the Scottish missionaries' account of the process. Now, we don't know for how many centuries they may have been doing it. We know it was recorded in the 19th century. And I started thinking, why don't we know these stories? I'm not suggesting that the history of Africa was some paradise, but how come we only learned about the slave trade and the killing of twins, and that sort of thing, but we didn't hear about the kings who, read the early accounts of the first Europeans to visit Benin, the Kingdom of Benin. It's like a village yokel coming to London for the first time. They're going like, the lights are so big, the streets are so clean. That was because this was a time London was like a hotbed of vice and corruption, and in Benin, people were leaving their windows open. And the reason why we don't know about those stories is because it would make it less plausible to say we colonized to bring education and health. Mm-hmm. Because how are you bringing healthcare to people who were doing cesarean sections? At the time, many Europeans weren't even doing it. How can you justify saying, you're bringing civilization to people who were exchanging ambassadors with European courts in the 16th century? So I think, those aspects were suppressed so that the others would be brought up. And, if you even look at it in terms of art, there was a wonderful exhibition at the British Museum called Kingdom of Ife a few years ago. And there were all these beautiful artifacts. There's an alabaster carved stool that was one of my favorite pieces. I think it was from the 15th century. And the director of the British Museum at the time, Neil MacGregor, said to us that when he was at art school, they were learning all about the art history of Europe and the Renaissance and all that. But at the very same time that was happening, that's when these carvings and bronze works were being made in Ife. But nobody talked to them about it. And so it's not in the global history of art. And, I think if as a young Black person, as a young African, seeing that alabaster stool and the beauty of it, nobody can tell you, oh, your people were just, a mass of savages running around until then. And so, that's how you then can put whatever sort of challenges people try to throw at you in context. And that's why we need to know those things, and thank goodness for, the internet and access to a lot more things But yes, I'm passionate about it. And I'm also conscious of the fact that we are not documenting a lot of these stories, and the older generations are dying. You know, my Uncle Lawrence died in April, you know, at the beginning of COVID. And, you know, I had always planned to go and do more in-depth, you know, you know, interviews and recordings with him. And so that's why, you know, I would say to anyone who's listening, you know, just ask your parents, you know, even simple things like, you know, what was your great-grandmother's name? You know, on both sides. Someone asked that on Twitter, and I realized I could only, you know, I knew only some of them. You know, we're not even talking about knowing anything about them, just their names. And yeah, we need those markers. Sorry, I told you.
The stories that, yeah. So I'm actually,
I'm a bit conscious of how much time, because I've got so many thoughts. I just want to know how can we ask a couple more questions?
We can probably go for. I feel like we're gonna have to do. I think we're gonna have to come back to this. I think
there's it might be a part 2.
Yeah, I feel like this really. I don't think we're even scratching the surface. Oh, let's go for one more quickly.
I'm not even gonna actually do any questions, because I think, as you say, I think there's something we can have kind of pick this conversation up to maybe do a part 2. I think there's a couple of just interesting comments and reflections, and that is that one, like for our own mum, we've been having this sort of conversation for the last few years about like her having these conversations with relatives to kind of extract those stories. Like, you know, we have a wonderful auntie in America and an uncle in Germany, and they have, you know, when you talk to them about these sorts of things, they're as close to us as getting the stories from our grandparents. And the richness of information about our family, but about Nigerian culture and history is just like, wow, like I've just just keep give it to me. It's fantastic. I think the other thing that you mentioned about being about this idea about being present for or living for today, but it's really interesting about this concept of anti-fragileness, you know, and how actually I think this pandemic has kind of shook a lot of this part of the world, because they almost felt that we had it all under control. We had developed certain systems, and then it just said the natural system just said nah. It just said no.
And I always feel, you know, that's a benefit, because, you know, because I lived with NEPA in Nigeria, where there were always power cuts. You know, in meetings here, we'd be planning things, and I'd be like, so what if the electricity goes? And they'd look at me like I was mad. But then when there was a power cut, they'd be like, you know, thank God you said that. And I think that's the beauty of, you know, knowing that you haven't got it sorted versus thinking you have.
So I just wanted to. First of all, I just want to say thank you, because even just some of what you just shared about the Ugandan medicine, that was just so interesting. But I remember so I actually went to the last TedxEuston. The theme then was legacy, and this kind of topic I remember really, really stuck with me, and some of the stories that were being shared, and we worked, and like there was a lot of conversation about getting those stories from your elders and recording those stories. And I just wanted to know if you were, especially I guess with the rise of technology, or like how technology is really helpful right now, if you're aware of any sort of initiatives where if someone is like getting those stories out, where these things are like a repository where things are being recorded, for anyone who's maybe listening who thinks, oh yeah, I do want to do this, and I want to make more of an effort to record my history or my family's history or something.
I think there are various initiatives that, you know, sort of come across. I know, for instance, there's amazing guy called Emeka Kizo, Ed Kizo, who's done quite a lot of work talking to people and interviewing. He did recently put out a film he had done in conjunction with the Center for Memories, for Igbo Center for Memories in Enugu, which was about the Biafran War, and interview, and he filmed, talking to lots of people. So I know around the, I think it was the 50th, the 50th anniversary of the end of the war is this year. And so there was a flurry of, I know there was someone also who was documenting, talking to women, Igbo women, Biafran women, about their experiences during the war, just documenting it. So I know there are those. In terms of a repository, the Center for Memories in Enugu is a brilliant initiative that's started. It's to commemorate the war, but also more broadly, Igbo history. And it's a small group of amazing people who've pulled it together. And it's early days, but they are doing quite a lot. So I think there is an appreciation. There's also an amazing young man I met at the Igbo conference last year, who has a website called Ukwu, where he just sort of grabs all these pictures and documents and articles and interviews about Igbo history and puts them on his website. And I had always thought it was some academic or very old person who ran it. And there's a young, second generation British Nigerian Igbo guy. And, he just was searching on the internet, finding things and putting it, and it's a wonderful repository, UKPURU, Ukwu. Yeah. So I think, I think those things are happening, but I think the important thing is, if it's just on your iPhone, if it's just on Zoom, because that's what I'm doing with my parents and their siblings. Zoom has a recording function. I say, okay, let's do 40 minutes this Saturday. I prepare my questions. What was your mother's name? What was your grandmother's name? Where was she born? What was she like? And it's the big questions and the little questions as well.
Mm. Mm. Thank you. I'm literally like, I've got homework. I've got to go start setting up some calls.
I think that is the big takeaway. The big questions are the little questions. Yeah. It doesn't always have to be these big histories, and you never know what you uncover.
Yeah, because we know so little,
So little.
I was saying to my mother, for instance, what was a typical day for you like, in 1945? When did you wake up? What did you do? Who cooked? What did you eat? Those are things that if you wanted to check in Britain, there are probably reams of volumes about it. But it'd be more difficult,
Yeah. So thank you for that. Let's chill. Let's chill. So you mentioned that music was like quite a big thing for you. So if there was a song that you felt represented your life, maybe as a whole, or maybe in this particular current time, what would that song be?
Ooh, that's a hard one. I don't know. I think I would probably just, I would probably pick Celestine Ukwu, Highlife. He has a song called Ijenu, which is quite melancholy. I've always liked it since I was a child. I think it was recorded either during the war or not long after. And Celestine Ukwu, died quite young. And Ijenu, it says, which is, those who are dying, those who are rejoicing, so it's really about, that's how life is, and I think that's how 2020 has been. Just that reminder of, the fullness and richness and sadnesses and joys of life and being human. And I think, Nijenu, it has that whole sense of, recognition that, like you said, we're not in charge. We can do our best, and that's something else I'm very conscious of. How lucky and blessed I've been, from being born to my parents, and having all of that. Those were all things that I didn't necessarily have any hand in. And so I'm often very conscious of there, but for the grace of God, yeah.
I'm going to have a little listen to that over sometime this week, to be honest. I remember having a little, when we started with Chuku's, we remember getting a couple of Highlife CDs, which just like playing in the car. It's like, yeah, really, really great. Film. What film do you love that you think that not enough people have watched?
That's a big one again. It's funny because I'm going to probably say something controversial. And I would say, and I'm not saying it's the best film in the world or that it's the most artistic, but the Biyi Bandele production of Chimamanda Adiche's Half of a Yellow Sun. I think it's the film that's moved me most, because I was very lucky to be invited to an early screening when it was still raw, because I know Biyi and Chimamanda and I grew up together, and so I remember being offered the opportunity because I think they just wanted to gauge what a young person felt. So it was the very first time it was being shown, in a screening room in Soho. And I remember getting the message saying, "Oh, could I possibly do this?" And I thought to myself, could I possibly what? Are you kidding me? I was like, cancel everything in my diary. And I went and watched it, and obviously the book had moved me a lot because it was pretty much the story of people like my parents and my grandparents. But what I hadn't bargained on was that at the end of the screening, lights were coming on, where all stretching, and I just broke down in tears. And I don't mean just tears. I was the gulping. And how it happened, I just hugged Biyi to congratulate, and then the tears just started coming. And I just remember Yewande Sadiku, who many people don't know, but she was actually a key person in making sure that film was made, pulling together the money from all over the world. And she went through, and I remember her just staring at me, and then all the white cameramen and everyone sort of looking like, what's wrong with this person? And I would, and I was trying to say, I'm sorry. Then the more I said that, I would cry more. And I didn't expect it. I didn't plan it. And I couldn't go back to the office. I just spent the whole day wandering around. I got online. I was Googling Biafra, Biafran photographs, Biafran this, Biafran that. And I just felt unsettled. And so I don't know if it's because of that, because why I sort of prefaced it with all of this is because there was a lot of people saying that he didn't do justice to the book. But, that was my experience. And I remember I rang my parents immediately. I got out and composed myself and I remember my mother saying, "Thank God the world will not forget our story." So yes, and I think it's important for that reason, because you often see many of the problems that led to the Biafran War. You see it recurring in different parts of the world, in different places, just like what led to the Second World War. And you just think, what's the matter with people? Don't they read history? Don't they know what, don't they know what starting out on this path where it ends? So yes, I think, that would be a film that I would very strongly recommend. Yeah, I'm just trying to think. I can't think of any other film, but certainly a book that's just come out that I've just read the first chapter of, and I want everyone to read it, is by a young Nigerian writer called Okamako Lisakwe. And it's, the first chapter was published in Grantor magazine. I can't even remember the name of the book, I'm sorry, but Okamako Lisakwe. But it's basically, that first chapter is a young girl who's trying to get into university. She's living in northern Nigeria, probably in the 1980s or 90s. And she has to go to visit this lawyer who knows some professors who might help her get in. But it's just so rich, I knew that time, and yes, I couldn't wait to see what would happen to this young girl. So that's one I would recommend. And I think along the same vein, I think everyone who's ever joked about the Nigerian 419 and advanced fee fraud should read I Do Not Come to You by Chance. And I hope someone's going to make a film of it one day. I don't know if you've come across it. It's a novel by Adobe Trisha Nwobani. It came out maybe 10 years ago now. And what it does is it tracks the genesis of one of these fraudsters, how he starts as a young middle class Nigerian child, and then how his parents, with the economy in Nigeria crashing in the 80s, thanks to the IMF structural adjustment, how lives were turned upside down. And when the black sheep of the family, his uncle, who everyone despised, but who had now become the wealthiest person, says, "Come and work for me," he has little choice. And, and I thought it was a very sensitive portrayal of where that comes from. And, for me, that's something I'm very conscious of. No matter what the issue is, while not making apologies for anyone, I always think it's important to sort of, one of the best pieces of advice I had in my career was, always try to think about the other person and put yourself in their shoes and where they're coming from. And I think it helps sometimes to, like I said, not excuse bad behavior, but, to put it in context.
Thank you.
Got 3 for the price of 1 there.
I think, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. As Ife and I said, we probably would like to have some more time at another point in time. I just didn't say.
No, we could have evening chat or afternoon chats.
Well, I'm liking the idea of coming over
tickets
some
and
rice.
Shoot the breeze.
I'll be there at the palm
play some Highlife and
So thank you for sharing so much.
Thank you.
Like about culture, about your own family's history, and just enlighten us with your conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.